Back on this June 6th, 2019, 75 years since Normandy, D-Day, June 6, 1944. Let me tell you, I know you've heard Colonel Jack Jacobs with Imus and with me and Bernie and with me solo just a couple of weeks ago. But if you don't remember Colonel Jack Jacobs' 2 heroic tours in Vietnam, listen to what this guy accomplished there. He was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Richard Nixon. But on top of that, included in that, I should say, 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts before he called it quits in 1987 as a colonel. As decorated as it gets. A true hero and now a great ambassador for the service. And a welcome guest to the Bernie and Sid Show, Colonel Jack Jacobs. Good morning, pal. How are you?
Hey, good morning, boys. How you doing?
Colonel Jack, we're doing well.
Nice to have you back. Nice to have you back. On this day, and again, you did serve in Vietnam. This was a little before then, but it doesn't matter. A hero is a hero. So when you look back at this specific day, June 6th, 1944, Colonel Jack, what does it mean to you?
Well, you know, D-Day was supposed to be June 5th, but the weather was lousy.
Right. The weather wasn't great on June 6th either, by the way.
Exactly right. And Eisenhower had a really tough decision. He had to go with it on the 6th because even though the weather was lousy like it was the day before, if he waited, he couldn't go again until the middle of the month because of the tides and all that stuff. And the losses would have been much too great. So he bit the bullet and sent him out on the 6th. We lost allies, more than 4,000 killed on that day, but we opened up a second front, and that was the beginning of the end of the war. So we had a lot of sacrifice on that day, and days after that too, to the end of the war. But it's a good thing we did it because that generation, our father's generation, they saved the world.
That's exactly right, Colonel Jack Jacobs. Again, a local guy. He grew up. He was born in Brooklyn and grew up in the projects in Queens, and then moved out to Woodbridge, New Jersey. But anyway, Colonel Jack, have you been to the to Normandy itself?
I have some years ago, and the thing that's really shocking is less the beach, less even the cliff at Pont de Hoc, but the cemetery, the American cemetery. In back of all that, row after row of markers of the young men who sacrificed on that day. It was I tell you, it's a good thing that the Germans they were hoodwinked by our deception campaign. We had this fake cardboard and inflatable tank army in England. We tried to convince them that we were coming over to Calais and not to Normandy.
The shortest distance between the 2 points.
Exactly right. They thought that's the way we would come. And on top of that, a bunch of the commanding generals went back to Germany for a command post exercise, a war game. Erwin Rommel tried to convince Hitler that, in fact, underneath an airport, tried to convince Hitler that, in fact, we were coming to Normandy and nobody would listen to him. Didn't reinforce, and thank goodness they didn't reinforce because that made it a little bit easier.
Yeah, you say a little bit easier. And Colonel Jack Jacobs with us, and you talk about deceiving the Germans. And for me, of course, like most Americans, whether it's Saving Private Ryan or watching some footage, that's all we know. But every time I watch it, Colonel, I'm amazed any of our kids survived. I mean, they were just sitting ducks. It was an unfair fight.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had to do it. We knew it was going to happen. I think that on that subject of Private Ryan, that opening sequence is the most accurate and horrifyingly accurate depiction of what combat is really like. It's just like that. Once you see that, you never want to be involved in it yourself. But and don't forget they were kids. They were just kids, 18, 19 years old. There was a Medal of Honor recipient, now gone. His name was Walt Ehlers, was part of the 1st Division, landed on D-Day, and his brother was also in his unit, and they made a pact. They said it's so important that we get inland, that we defeat these guys, that if one of us gets hit, the other brother is not going to stop to take care of him. He's going to keep going. And sure enough, they landed on the beach, and his brother got hit and was killed, and he kept going. Wow. He received the Medal of Honor for action later on that day, and he died just a couple of years ago, Walt Ehlers. But there were more heroics on that day than you could possibly count and you could possibly reward. And that's why everybody who was there. Indeed, anybody who's in combat will tell you the same thing. If he were decorated with anything, he says he would tell you, I wear it not for me, but for all those who were heroic, and they can't wear it because they're not here.
That's right, Colonel Jack Jacobs. And they were kids just like you were in Vietnam, and some of the exploits that you went through, saving people's lives and stuff like that, 19, 20 years old. I mean, when you think about it, it is really incredible. And we thank you, of course, for your service. But the bigger picture here now, if the United States did not, or the Allies did not prevail on D-Day, if they were pushed back, the commanding general, Eisenhower, he actually wrote a letter announcing that we failed, and I take full responsibility. I mean, it was not a guaranteed thing that we would win this at that.
No, it was actually it was a very close thing.
Yeah.
I mean, all the elements were against us. So you're trying to make a frontal assault on a bunch of reinforced positions. It not only wasn't guaranteed, it was a jump ball actually, and that's why Eisenhower wrote that letter. Thank goodness he didn't have to send it.
Thank God. That 50-mile stretch of beach in Normandy was really carved up into 5 sections: Utah, Gold, Juno, Omaha, and Sword. And I guess Omaha was the most difficult of the 5. And why was that, Colonel Jack?
It was farther away from the other beaches to which the forces had to link up. The beach was deepest there, and the Germans had very good sight over that beach, much better than on other beaches. We knew that would be the toughest beach. The artillery, we knew that the enemy artillery was trained on that beach, and it turned out that their estimates were exactly right. That was the toughest beach of all.
Yes, and that, by the way, that fictitious army group that you talked about, it was actually the one that to deceive the Germans was led by General Patton, believe it or not.
Patton.
And that route that they thought that they deceived the Germans into thinking that we were going to invade is where the channel is today, from Britain to Calais in France. But Colonel Jack Jacobs, listen, again, the bigger picture here is the Russians were coming from the other side, the Soviets, who had initially collaborated with the Nazis, but now they were they were bleeding. It was savage, the war between them and the Nazis. Without the Eastern Front, it would have been a different war for us. I mean, it would have been much more bloody.
Yeah, it would have been much more difficult. And also the poor strategic decisions by Hitler. Even though during the War of 1812, Napoleon said, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go invade Russia. I'm going to go try to get Moscow. And it was an abject failure. Hitler decided to do exactly the same thing. And it was the dumbest thing he possibly could have done. Sapped all of his resources. And of course, the Russians then counterattacked and managed to prevail, which was astounding in itself because Stalin had purged all the experienced leaders from the Soviet army, a dumb thing too. But anyway, they prevailed, and we opened up the second front. We decided in 1943 that we were going to have unconditional surrender. It took us that long to decide that, and the only way we were going to do that is to open up a second front, which we did 75 years ago today.
Let me ask you this, Colonel Jack Jacobs. What did we learn today from World War II? You know, people are so quick to use World War III. Obviously, I have no respect for what happened twice before, but I understand the issues in the Middle East and Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and folks, I guess paranoid folks, really think that we're on the precipice of another world war. I think that's ridiculous, but what did we learn 75 years later from World War II?
Well, first of all, I think you're right, and a lot of strategic thinkers agree with you. We're not on the verge of World War III. We certainly have a lot of enemies, but they're fragmented, and we have other problems we need to solve. But trying to avert World War III isn't one of them. We have a lot of tests of our resolve and of our interests, but for sure we're not on the verge of World War III. What we did learn, however, I mean, I'm telling you, this is from my standpoint, but I think a lot of people agree, that if you're going to prevail in a very difficult environment, that you can't be selective about who is actually going to serve the country. You're talking to somebody who believes in universal service, I think if you're lucky enough to live in a free country, you owe it something in the form of service. And one of the things we learned in the Second World War, when we had more than 19 million Americans in uniform to go save the world, that if we leave it to a very small number of people, if we do not prepare for war, we will not have peace. I can't remember who said that, but it was somebody famous, and I can't remember who it was. But it's absolutely true. If you want peace, prepare for war.
Certainly.
Don't think you're going to get it, but we do have to have a commitment to defend our interests. We don't have that, we are going to be in trouble.
And one other thing we learned, Colonel Jacobs, you could expand on it in the minute we have left, is that unlike World War I, after which they pretty much just they savaged economically the aggressors, Germany, and it led to World War II. We had the Marshall Plan after World War II, during which we actually rejuvenated these countries and their economies, both Japan and in Europe with the Marshall Plan, and they became capitalist societies and our allies today.
Well, and that's what we learned from World War I. You got to co-opt your enemies into your way of thinking. If they're not going to agree, they're not going to agree, and you keep beating them up. But if you really want to win the war, you got to also win the peace. And the Marshall Plan did exactly that. Co-opt the enemy, turn him into something he was not, and you're going to be much better off for it. And the result of that was a generation of peace. We got to remember that. You're absolutely right.
Always a magnificent conversation, Colonel Jack Jacobs. Once again, to repeat what Bernie said earlier, thank you so much for your service, and we love you, pal. Keep coming back. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernie. Thanks, Sid. Be well.
You too. The great Colonel Jack Jacobs.